Do you mind if I keep filming? This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Mel.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 9 of season 6, and we're continuing our series about found footage with a discussion of the new Netflix series Archive 81. So as you may have noticed, just kind of want to lead off with this, that Mel and I it's just going to be the two of us this time. Lisa wasn't able to make it, but don't worry, she'll be back for the next episode. I don't know what's going on with this season, but we've had more scheduling issues, I think, this season than we have any other season, but Lisa will be back for the next one. Like I said in the intro, we're going to spend this episode talking about the first couple of episodes, not the entire season, but just the first couple of episodes of the new Netflix series Archive 81. And well, this is new at the time of us recording this, which is early February of 2022. I believe it came out in January 2022. And so it's been on Netflix for a couple of weeks, at least at this point. And one thing to mention for those of you that are our Patreon supporters, you will already know this, but we do mini episodes for our $5 a month supporters. I release those on our off weeks when we're not releasing main episodes. And our previous mini episode was actually about the source material for Archive 81 because it began its life as a podcast. Much like the Black Tapes, it was a serialized fictional podcast. It's had 3 seasons at this point, I believe, and it's been on a bit of a hiatus, but they have said that it will be returning for another season. I assume part of the hiatus is due to the pandemic, and part of it may have been due to developing the show with Netflix. But if you want to get a more in-depth discussion, definitely check out our Patreon page, and you can hear our discussion of the podcast. But the TV show, I'll go ahead and start it off by saying it is in a lot of ways different from the podcast. It keeps a lot of similar tropes and ideas, a lot of the same characters are there, but the plot is a little bit different. Now, I haven't listened to all of the podcast, so perhaps it does come more in line as the podcast itself goes on. They are fairly short episodes, usually about 15 to 20 minutes a piece, I think 30 minutes at the most, and these are hour-long TV episodes. But that was the first thing I noticed. I had actually started watching the show before we decided to do that mini episode on the podcast. So I was about, maybe 3 or 4 episodes in when I listened to the podcast. And I only listened to the first 2 episodes or so. But there's some very distinct differences in at least the openings of them. And I guess I should say, I think I mentioned it, but we'll probably only be discussing maybe the first 2 episodes or so of the TV show for this episode. I know Mel said before we started recording that I think she's only watched the first 2. I've completely finished the season, so I will try to keep my comments spoiler free, not just for you all, but for Mel. But there are some potential spoilers, at least for the first 2 episodes while we're discussing this. So just wanted to throw out that warning as well. One thing, I guess, to kind of note on just kind of overall summary for this, if you're not familiar with the show or the podcast, kind of the overall plot of it is we've got this character named Dan he's a curator at a museum, and he gets brought in to help digitize this collection of old videotapes from the early 90s, 1994-ish. And in doing that, you get to see the actual footage as it was recorded on that 1990s video camera of a woman named Melody Pendris, who is a graduate student. It never really specifies exactly what discipline it is. It's kind of hinted that it could be like anthropology or history, or may even be psychology, but I think it'd be closer to anthropology or history. But she's working on a dissertation and decides to do an oral history of a museum. Or not, I'm sorry, a uh, apartment building in New York City called the Visser. And we come to find out that there's a lot of just sort of weird things about the Visser as Dan is bringing about, like setting about to restore this footage. And I think one of the things, and if Lisa were able to join us, I know she would comment on this. One of the nice things about it is that it's not super shaky cam. You do see some of that when you see the handheld camera footage from Melody Pendris. And I don't remember if it's done this yet in the first 2 episodes. So Mel, pardon me if this is a minor spoiler, but there are times in the season where you actually get to see the viewpoint from Melody's like timeline, so to speak, where it's not just from the camera, where you see other actors and it's done like a shot like a regular TV show. So it helps with that, motion sickness or uncomfortableness of the from like the Blair Witch Project, which I know Lisa has said before that was something that has triggered motion sickness in her. So that is a really nice thing, is that there are lots of times where it is not that handheld shaky camera footage, and I think that's a really big plus on the TV shows. I think it was a smart decision. But I'm going to stop now and kind of turn it over to Mel to kind of get some of her initial thoughts and impressions on this, because I have been talking for a little while now, and I don't want to step on Mel. So Mel, what are your just kind of overall initial thoughts on the show?
Well, so far I'm really enjoying it. Listeners, don't think because I've only watched the first couple episodes at this point that it's that I don't enjoy it. I'm definitely going to finish it. I know when we had first thrown the idea of talking about this series out there, and we were a little nervous because it come out so recently, I think about going much beyond like the first or second episode. So I knew I was going to watch those to be prepared. But yeah, it was difficult for me to stop watching, even though I was afraid, like I told you, Matt, it might push up against our recording time. And I decided to wait. Probably this weekend, I'll get a little further in it. And people who listen to our Patreon episode about the podcast know that I was enjoying the podcast, and I've downloaded several more episodes of that because, like you said, they're really bite-sized chunks that you can get through pretty quickly, at least the first season of the podcast. Yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I know I've read some stuff online about the first couple episodes of people's reactions to it, and people have noticed like it has I think one person called a stately pace. But I like the slow burn aspect of it. I feel like that kind of ups the creepiness and the claustrophobia of it to walk you through. And I feel like a story like this, where 2 people in 2 different times are kind of connecting with each other, I guess you could say, via footage that was left over. I think it needs a slow burn because you need to get to know the 2 characters and what motivates them. And it also allows them to plant little Easter eggs for mysteries that go throughout. So the next couple of things I'm going to talk about are spoilers. So if you just for the first episode, so if listeners, if you haven't watched it at all and you want to be spoiler free, like kind of hum, or fast forward a little bit. But I love the way they ended episode 1 with, well, I love the way the guy who hires Dan drops these hints about Dan's life that Dan thinks no one could ever know, because Dan is super private. And so that in itself makes it creepy as to why he's the one being asked to digitize these tapes and kind of curate them to a certain extent. And then the other thing was the thing that you learn at the end of the episode, which is that his father may have had some connection to Melody. So I'm assuming, as a person who only watched the first couple episodes, that that's one of the central mysteries that will be explored. And several of the mysteries that are set forth, like the fact that the building was burned down at some point and was built on the site of a mansion that burned down. So you have this cyclical kind of thing there. But you also have the kind of warnings about this, I think it's the sixth floor. Those things come from the podcast. But one of the articles that Lisa actually shared with us about Archive 81 was from the Wrap, and it was a discussion with the showrunner, Rebecca Sonnenschein. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. She talked about how they wanted to use the podcast as like a jumping off point, or like an inspiration frame to a certain extent, and take it in their own direction. So she described it as a jumping off point rather than a blueprint. So she's like, she wanted it to, the writers wanted it to capture the spirit of the podcast and follow some of the broad strokes, but to also be its own thing. So like, if you're interested in listening to the podcast after watching the show, go for it. But I don't think this is one of those things where they were like, we are going to strictly adapt this to the screen. And I guess the other thing I would say that I really liked about it was, well, what you mentioned about the lack of shaky cam. You didn't spoil anything for me with that, Matt. Like in the first two episodes, we already have where it'll start with Dan watching the footage that Melody recorded. And then we shift to where we're actually with Melody. And so we can see that she's still recording because she has the camera up and the red lights on, but we're not watching precisely what Dan is watching. Now, when we need to watch what Dan is watching because of static or because he sees something that relates to him or whatever, we pull back out and have the found footage aspect. And I really like that, because not necessarily because shaky cam bothers me. I mean, I don't love shaky cam, but it doesn't bother me as much as I think it bothers Lisa. But I liked it because I felt like it was setting up Melody as her own kind of character with her own story in a way that if we were just watching her through like a little screen, it wouldn't work. Plus, if you have too much found footage, I think it could get tedious maybe for the viewer. And we don't see this yet, but we see hints that other media may be involved too. And I thought that was kind of cool that they're taking found footage and maybe like expanding the definition of what we think that it could be. And I thought that was really fun. But I don't know, maybe we should start, Matt, with something that we talked about, right? We didn't talk about it very in depth, but right before we started recording, I did mention that I thought it was interesting that they had to find so many reasons for Melody to be recording all the time. I don't know. Do you think it didn't bother me that was the case? Though I have to admit, at one point when she took her camera with her, when she went outside the building with someone, it kind of like threw me off. Or when she's like walking around in stores with it on and things like that. I feel like, however, the fact that she's working on the project gives her a believable reason to be doing that. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? Does it like strain is that a problem of found footage that we have to find a way for her to be recording all the time? Or do you think they handle it pretty well?
A little bit of both, if I'm being honest. I think that is just an overall problem of the found footage genre, is explaining why people are still continuously recording something, even in the face of what are usually weird and escalating events. And I know in general when I'm watching found footage, and I had to do this a little bit when we watched Hell House LLC as well, is I have to remind myself to suspend my disbelief here. I mean, there are definitely some moments where it kind of, if you think about it too hard about why she was recording at this one particular time, or why is she always recording, and I think it's a flaw of the genre, but it's not something that I think is a defect in the genre. I think it's just something that most of these films or podcasts or whatever have to at least acknowledge and try to explain in a as believable way as possible why these people are continuously recording something. And using the idea for Melody of this oral history of the apartment building, I thought that was a pretty believable one. I mean, there are definitely moments throughout the season where, yes, you you kind of go, would she really still be recording this? Or why did she happen to be recording at this particular time? Those sorts of things. And also, I mean, if you really think too much about it, I mean, there are a couple of times later in the season, and this is not a spoiler, but it does show quite a large number of videotapes that she's recorded. So I mean, they acknowledge that, but you have to ask questions like, well, where is she keeping all these tapes? Because you don't really ever see them in the foreground. And my goodness, this is a 1990s video camera. I mean, it's going to be battery powered. She's either recharging a gigantic battery or constantly going through like C or D cell batteries. And it, so, yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of thing like lots of other fiction where you just have to acknowledge that, okay, it may not be 100% believable here, but if you do suspend your disbelief, and I'm willing to do that for the genre, as long as it's a compelling story, I'm willing to overlook it a little bit just to let the story unfold. But yeah, there are definitely some moments where you kind of have to say, I don't know if an actual person would be recording this or just running or whatever. But those are my thoughts. I mean, do you feel the same way? Or
Yeah, I agree. I like the fact that they address it, like you said. Like, I feel like if they just let it go and didn't, I mean, one time a character even asked her, like, you're still recording the, like, and so I like the fact that they don't ignore it and that they try to at least bring it in. There was one part, and I guess I won't give away too much because this is in the second episode, but she's like, I think people know this is a horror thriller show. So she's going to be surreptitiously recording things. And she was surreptitiously recording something, and it was kind of a scary moment where she was hiding. And I was like, the people could see the red light on on the camera, I would think. And so I found my anxiety rising because I was like, cover up the red dot on your camera. And so, I mean, I don't know, maybe she did and I was missing something, but I was just like, you are so close to being given away by the fact that you have this camera going, even though I understand why you're doing what you're doing. But I like the way the show so far, like just in the first episode even, is setting up an ambiguity to what's going on, because I feel like you can watch the first episode and there are multiple things that could be going on here, which I thought was really cool. Like this could be, the people act really weird. So I think even from the first episode, you're like, is this going to be, you know, is this like, is someone going to preying on either of these people, or what's going on in this building? I mean, I think even in the first episode, she starts to hear weird music and chanting and things like that. So there's a human threat there, but they also weave in the fact that there could possibly be like a supernatural threat as well, with the character of Jess, who I really like what they're doing with that character. It's they're doing something really kind of interesting and slightly different with that character than how that character was dealt with in the podcast. But yeah, the idea of like, does this character possibly have like epilepsy? The character's mother believes that she's possessed. So I liked the way all these different threats were thrown into the mix from the very beginning, because I felt like when I was watching the first episode, even though I kind of had an idea what might be happening from listening to the podcast, I still was like, okay, where's the threat here? Is it the guy Davenport that hired Dan? Is it the people in the building? And then how's that going to affect Dan? And then you also have a little bit of like both of the characters, at least Dan, it's implied that he had to be hospitalized at one point for his mental health. And I feel like Davenport might be preying on that as well. I don't know. It's very kind of Shirley Jackson-esque in the ambiguity and the way that the threats could be coming from all different angles. And I thought that was really cool. I think if I hadn't known anything about it and I watched that first episode, that would have hooked me.
Well, absolutely. And to kind of circle back to a point that you had made in your just kind of overall response to it is, yeah, this is a bit of a slow burn of a show. And that was something that I liked about it. And the reason I liked it is, I mean, it's it's got the horror aspect. It's got the tension of all of these potential threats, and everything has an ominous tone to it. I mean, there's not a thing in this show except possibly for Dan's friend Mark, and even he, I think, occasionally has some ominous moments. But yeah, like everything from Virgil Davenport, the guy who's hired Dan, there seems something shady going on with him. The people at the Visser, like almost every one of them seems like they might be hiding something. They're a little creepy, they're a little weird, and I love that about this, and the fact that it takes its time setting things up so that it does have a better payoff. And I think if I were to compare it to something, and I don't remember if you've seen this or not, Mel, but the other recent show on Netflix from last fall, the Mike Flanagan show, Midnight Mass, where that show was a very slow burn in the first couple of episodes. And then once things start really going, the pace does pick up, but it has to kind of establish the setting. It has to establish the characters. It has to establish everything. And one thing that Archive 81 does really well is building that tension of not really knowing, like you said, Mel, what the threat is, but also, I mean, Dan himself is an unreliable character, because yes, they do hint that he has had some previous mental history or mental health history. And that is one thing that Davenport even mentions when, and one thing that I guess we should back up and mention, I don't think we actually said this, the restoration of the tapes that Dan's doing, because they are fragile and delicate, they according to Davenport, they can't be transported from their location, which happens to be this like abandoned research facility out in the woods in like northern New York, like upstate New York. It's apparently like 12 or 13 miles from the nearest town. There's no cell service. I mean, he's out on these grounds in these woods pretty much alone constantly. And so then you have to ask that question of, is his isolation causing him to see things that aren't really there? And so we're seeing things kind of from his viewpoint. So like the things happening with Melody, are they real, or is that Dan's interpretation of the weirdness? I'm not going to give any spoilers on answering any of those questions, but I do have some answers to those questions, but I won't reveal anything. But what I guess my overall point, and I've been trying to say this, but I keep distracting myself, is that I think both of these parallel storylines, both Melody and Dan, are basically an investigation where both of them have been brought, like they've stepped into something mostly innocuous. Dan is a little curious as to why he's being offered a large sum of money to restore and digitize these tapes. I think it's like $100,000 or something like that. But it's seemingly fairly innocuous. Come out here, restore these tapes. We pay you a lot of money. You go about your business. Melody wants to come in, interview the people that live at the Visser. She's living there while she's doing the thing so that she can, have easy access to the tenants there. But the idea is that she's just going to interview them and talk about the history of the building. And then she hears the creepy stuff coming up through her, I guess, what is it? The radiator, this chanting and music. And both of them kind of are these investigations. And if you think of them as an investigation, yeah, it has to set up the mystery. It has to let the mystery unravel, and definitely has to create some moments of tension throughout where, you're worried about these characters. So I personally really like all of that.
Yeah, I do too. And I like the way you were bringing that out. Yeah. And, one thing that I was thinking about too, along with that, is the way both of these characters are kind of isolated, even when they're not completely alone. I mean, Dan is alone a lot once he goes out into the woods in the abandoned research facility, but he is ultimately, through various means, able to communicate with Mark briefly, and he does leave it at one point to meet Mark. And Melody, she can leave the Visser, I guess, at least in the first episode, but she also like there's a scene where she and her roommate is like, I'm going to be so lonely when you're gone, kind of like joking around, but you get the impression they're extremely close and they've been roommates for a while. And so this is something big for her too. I mean, I think she might even mention that going to live alone, have her own apartment is going to be weird for her. And so, yeah, and the way everybody in the Vista is so creepy and doesn't really want to talk to her at first also heightens that kind of isolation. And then you put on top of it the fact that Mark is afraid. What was it? One of the issues that Dan had when he was ill was that he was extremely paranoid, and he, you know, basically, I don't, they didn't describe if he was having like hallucinations or what, but he thought that people were watching him and things like that. And so when he starts to kind of unravel, I think his friend Mark is like, oh no, is this, and I'm sure Davenport's probably preying on that it isolates you more if people don't trust you when you say certain things are happening. So far in the first episode or so, Mark seems to be a stand-up guy and is like trying to help him and keep talking to him. But yeah, I love these little things these little aspects that they put to these characters visually and with their characterization that, one, like you said, slowly reveal certain things about them, which makes us care about them, but also two, really deepens that horror, like mystery aspect of it, because we're kind of like going on this creepy adventure with them. And in order to be vulnerable to whatever the horrors are, they've got to be isolated from people in some way, shape, or form. And I also love the architecture of those places too. I really started thinking about it in episode 2. I can't articulate it very well, but I just like the fact that we have two almost like haunted spaces in a way, where both of them are experiencing weird, out of the ordinary things, whether they're inexplicable or maybe explicable in other ways, in the spaces that they're in. And there's like times when Dan's going through the research facility where he's in, and he realizes that he can't open any of the doors except for the couple that he needs for his job. That's in the first episode. And the shots like down the hallways, like when he's doing these things, and the angles, it just, I don't know, it really built the tension for me. Not necessarily because I was like, something's going to come from my corner, but just showing how alone he is, and how he's in someone else's space and he kind of almost feels controlled. And Melody too, like there's those shots of her like going up and down the stairwells, and her going like the hallways, and the doors are shut against her and people not answering their doors. Like even the spaces that they're in kind of translate that isolation and like disconnect they feel as they're trying to solve these mysteries. And maybe that's what makes Dan start to connect with Melody at first before the mystery of his past gets involved, because maybe he kind of feels like she's similar to him in her situation in some ways.
Well, I can totally see that, especially, well, like you said earlier, and you kind of mentioned it in passing, but I think it is worth mentioning again. Dan's extreme privacy, and to the point where he is like visibly shaken when Davenport tells him something offhanded about his past, and Davenport says something right afterwards saying, well, we did a real thorough check, a real thorough background check of you or something. But it was definitely one of those, like he is intensely private and intensely alone. And yet, even still, I mean, I think there's a big difference between being alone in a big city and being alone out in the country. And he's coming from New York City, where, yes, he is a loner, but you're still surrounded by people most of the time when you're not in your apartment or house. And going into this isolated space. And I think for him being in that isolated space, it does sort of correlate with Melody's isolation as well. And to add on to what you had said about her roommate, she actually, and I made a note of this, like it stuck out of my head, where she said that this is the first time she's ever lived alone. So she has always, had some sort of person that she was living with, be it family, and then roommate in college, and probably roommate in grad school. And I don't know if it's the same roommate that she has now or not. But this is a person who's always lived with somebody who now for the very first time is alone and isolated in this building full of creepy people. And so yeah, I think there is a kindred kinship between the two. And without giving anything away, I will say that yeah, there's definitely some parallels between Dan and Melody, more than just what's been hinted at in these first two episodes. but but yeah, I think the isolation is a real key aspect of this, because for me the place where Dan is, it reminds me in a weird way of kind of the Stanley Hotel from The Shining. I mean, he's not.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, he's not snowed in there, but he's basically trapped there. There is a moment later in the show where he does actually leave and meet Mark in the nearby town, so he's not completely trapped there. But yeah, like you were saying, some of the framing of the shots, it almost reminded me even of Kubrick's version of The Shining, with some of the ways that the camera would like lead and then let him go around a corner and then you go around the corner behind him. Those sorts of things, just kind of, there's probably nothing on the other side, but there's still just that tension of being alone in this isolated place, and not everything is lit because he's turning lights off as he goes, not leaving lights on throughout the whole complex, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it really, I could see some definite parallels between him and The Shining.
Yeah, I like that connection to The Shining, especially. I mean, in the Visser too. Not like the hallways look like The Shining, but yeah, the shots and the way they're put together. This is not really about the show, I guess, to a certain extent, but I feel like, I don't know about you, Matt, but I feel like watching this while we're in a pandemic also kind of heightened the feelings that I have for poor Dan when he gets isolated in the wilderness. I found myself wondering while I was watching it if pre-pandemic Mel would have had such a visceral feeling of kind of like the isolation and fear for poor Dan as post-pandemic Mel. And also, like, there were things that I think before the pandemic I wouldn't have paid attention to that I started paying attention to more now, because I just automatically think about people having to stay close to home. So like all the stocking up of stuff so he doesn't have to go anywhere, or him trying to figure out like how to spend his time. I don't know about you, but that all struck me slightly differently, I think, watching it now than if I had watched it in 2019.
I think you're right. At least for me, I mean, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I would agree that watching this in well, I mean, I don't even want to say post-pandemic, because I mean, we're still kind of in the middle of it. It's not quite as bad as it was in 2020 and 2021, but COVID is still around, and there's still plenty pandemic to go around. But yeah, I definitely think that having gone through that experience in my life, it had an effect on me. I mean, I definitely, well, I mean, I count myself lucky that I was able to work from home throughout the pandemic. But at the same time, I mean, that isolation, I literally went a very long time not seeing anybody besides my immediate family, and I'm glad that I had them. There was a time years ago when I lived by myself, and if the pandemic had happened then, I'm not quite sure how my mental health would have been compared to the pandemic now. And so yeah, I don't know, it's one of those, I don't even know if I can think about how pre-pandemic Matt would have responded to this. I think that he would have been drawn in by the characters as well, but there was definitely something like to that isolation that I could feel a certain kinship with, because there were definitely plenty of times when I felt really stir crazy, but at the same time either couldn't leave or there was nowhere to go. I mean, yes, we would go to the store to get food, but aside from that, nothing was open. There was no place to go. It was a pandemic. So anyway, yeah, I agree. That's a long-winded way of saying that.
At least we didn't have creepy Virgil Davenport ordering us to digitize tapes and whatnot. Like that helps.
Well, that is true. That is true. And he is, I mean, I remember one thing that you had mentioned in the mini episode, that the voice of the actor playing Virgil Davenport in the podcast sounds a lot like Chris Cooper. And I gotta say, the actor kind of reminds me, in the show here, the TV show, reminds me a little bit of Chris Cooper as well. Not 100%, but I can definitely see a resemblance between the two of them. And Chris Cooper does creepy well.
Yeah, I didn't look at who the actors were beforehand, and I was like, is Chris Cooper going to play Mr. Davenport? But no, he didn't. But yeah, there is kind of a similarity maybe in like the cadence of the voice, but it's like dead on similar to me in the podcast. All right. I feel like since Lisa wasn't able to be with us, that we should allow her to be here in spirit, Matt. And one of the things that she was texting us when she was watching episode 2. So, listeners, again, we're going to spoil episode 2. And we said we were talking about 1 and 2. When she was watching episode 2, she texted us when Melody finally discovers that there seems to be something culty, I guess we'll say cultish so far, going on in the Visser, to kind of explain the chanting that she heard in episode 1, but didn't understand what it was. And I hadn't gotten there at that point, but from what she was describing, it sounded scary to me. And so I watched episode 2 today, and yes, it is creepy. So I feel like we need to talk a little bit about it. Basically, Melody wakes up in the middle of the night, hears the chanting, decides, I would not have done this, decides to take her camera and go see what's going on. And she goes into the community room, I guess it is a rec room, and not all of the people were in the Visser, of course, but a good number of people. I mean, I would say maybe 30 people, maybe less than that. 25, 30 people are in this room sitting there looking at this statue, creepy looking statue in a cabinet. And they're humming. It almost sounds like an electronic sound, but they're like humming this sound. And this is music that we've heard since episode 1. Characters will be playing it or humming it or singing it, or it'll be in the music. And it's really creepy. It's like they're all meditating together or something. And a couple of the people she's met that she thought were relatively harmless are in this room doing this. And she's really creeped out. But the part that scared Lisa and caused her to text us was when they get to like a certain point in their humming and meditation, they start making gasping noises, and then they gradually start breathing at the same time. But it's like this huffing sound, or like really hard, kind of agonized breathing that they're doing, but they're all doing it at the same time. And I admit, like watching that, I think there had been some scary stuff so far, but it was more like creepy, crawly, weird tension. Jess having one of her seizures, that pushed it to scary. But I don't know about you, Matt. I felt like when she finally sees these people doing this, it's like I would not have just hidden in the coat closet. I would have gone out the door I came in and not lived at the Visser anymore. I would have been done at that point.
Right. Going back to earlier in the episode where we talked about, concocting reasons for people to be recording, that's another part of found footage, that having a reason for people to continue staying when things get weird and creepy. And I also, dissertation be damned, I would have been packing my bags and moving out of the Visser as well. I may have continued the project, but not from living in this creepy place. But yeah, that scene in particular really got to me as well. Maybe not quite to the level that it seemed to affect Lisa, but no, that was definitely a real creepy moment, because there's, I mean, it's hard to even do it justice without seeing it as to how truly unnerving it kind of is. I mean, this is a room full of people staring at this statue and humming, and then they all start doing this like hyperventilating breathing. I mean, it's like kind of thing, but not even like that. Like that's not even a, I don't know, but it's all in unison and in tandem, and there's no signal for them to start doing it. They just all know when to start doing it, so it's all like in sync, and it is creepy stuff, like super super creepy. And I mean, it's of course that's another one of those things. I mean, it raises lots more questions. I mean, is this some sort of cult? That's kind of seems like it's very much leaning that way at this point. What in the world is this statue of that they're seeing? Because we don't really get a clear view of it, and it's in this wooden cabinet thing that has doors on the front so that afterwards it gets closed, so even Melody isn't able to get close to see it and see what this thing is. And I mean, there's a whole heck of a lot of what is going on and what are these people doing, and oh my gosh, Melody, get out of this place. This is not a good place to be.
I mean, even when the Samuel guy, who in the first episode, we know he's an important person because around the time when Jess has her episode, she's talking about him. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I've only seen 2 episodes, but like when they all started breathing at the same time, I'm like, is this a possession? Like, I don't, because there is like the talk of exorcism in the first episode. So I don't know, that's just me throwing stuff out there. But yeah, I was just like, okay, fine. So you stayed and you saw this. Then when they leave, she tries to open the cabinet, which I probably would not have done. And then she ends up getting like, so Samuel and the composer of the scary opera, we talked about that in the podcast, in the mini episode, there's a woman who lives in the Visser who composes these creepy operas that are like about hell and purgatory and violence. And every time Melody hears this music, she gets sick or ill. Samuel and the composer woman then proceed to have sex in the room after everybody's gone, and Melody's still there. And I'm just like, the whole time I was just so tense, like thinking she was going to get discovered, even though I figured it's episode 3 and it would probably be too soon for that to happen. I just really felt like she was playing with fire there. And I guess I don't want to spoil this because it's a major mystery, but she has her own reasons for doing this dissertation. They're personal, and I guess those were driving her to stay. But yeah, that I feel like in episode 2, that was truly like a big kind of moment when the tension was raised a bit higher than the slow burn of the previous episode and the previous part of 2, because you realize there's a serious threat to her and that there's probably a lot more going on. Well, there is a lot more going on than she understands. And I had the subtitles on, and I wondered if some of the stuff that Samuel and the composer were talking about when they came back in was related to Melody. Even I thought it was effective, even though I wanted Melody to get out of there, because it definitely raised the tension in a way that I think they needed to do at that point.
What were they even saying? Because I don't remember. It's been too long.
She was like questioning if he knew what he was doing, and he's like, don't worry, I have control and everything's coming to plan, or something to that effect. And she was like questioning, and I wondered, because remember, she looked at Melody so weirdly when Melody said Samuel invited her to the opera. And
yes,
I
okay.
thought that they were probably, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that they were supposed to be talking about what he was doing with Melody.
Okay.
That was the impression I got, because she was like questioning him and he was like, no, I'm in complete control. I know what I'm doing. I don't know. You've watched farther than me, so.
Right. Well, and it's got that double-edged meaning to it with something like that too, where I mean, is he talking about what he's doing with Melody? Because he did essentially take her on a date to that creepy opera.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also maybe she's questioning if he knows what he's doing with whatever they're doing with this crazy weird demon statue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's definitely some double entendre there that we're not quite sure what that relates to, or perhaps it could even be both. But Yeah, the are you sure you know what you're doing? Yeah, I'm in complete control. I've heard that a lot of times when people are talking about summoning demons, and it doesn't usually go well for them.
Yeah, summoning demons is one of those things that's really unpredictable, I would think. 'Cause I imagine they have their own plan for what they want.
Well, if at least books and movies haven't lied to me, that's definitely the case. but but yeah, I'm not going to comment on whether or not that is actually the case, since I have finished the season. But I will say, yeah, that particular scene there is some good use of that double meaning of not even quite knowing what they're referring to, but in either case, it's definitely creepy. Well, I think that is probably actually a good point for us to wrap up the discussion on. We've kind of reached the end of episode 2, plot wise, but without revealing any other sort of spoilers, I don't want to start talking too much more either, because I definitely want Mel to be able to watch the rest of the show unspoiled, and you listeners as well. So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap that discussion up. But before we go, did just want to remind you all, first of all, if you haven't seen it yet, we are super proud and excited by our new podcast artwork from the absolutely amazing and talented Lynn Hansen. So if you normally listen to the podcast on your phone or somewhere else and aren't looking at the artwork, just do us a favor and turn your screen on for a second and look at that. We super excited by it. But the other thing is that we have used that artwork as well as the basis for the new merchandise that we do now have available on our website. If you go to our website, we have a variety of things that you can buy with our new artwork and logo on. And so check it out at nofearcast.com. That's KNOW fearcast.com. And just a reminder as well that we are at No Fearcast on Twitter and Instagram, and we do also have a Facebook page as well. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com, and we do love getting emails from our listeners. We truly enjoy that. And if you love what we're doing, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. $5 a month will get you access to exclusive mini episodes that are released in our off weeks between our main episodes. Or if you can't afford to do that, you can always just rate or review us on whatever podcast app that you are listening to us on. It's entirely free, and it does help other listeners find us. Our theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we will be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.